Hey, Jen.
Hey, Jenny.
Thanks so much for being a guest on this podcast, Founder Design Thinking. Everyone, welcome to episode 8, where our goal is to find more than 10 unicorns like us who are founders who also do design thinking. I'm Jay-Z, and I love taking companies from 0 to 1 and getting that initial traction. Help me welcome Jen.
Hi, Jenny. Hi. I'll give a quick background. I have a long history in design, but started out actually in finance. So I have a different perspective on the concepts of design and design thinking. And I focus my practice and my teaching. I teach at Parsons School of Design, and I have a practice called Reason Street. And my primary medium is designing business models.
I love that. It's so fascinating just to combine these two things that are too often separate. Why don't we get into it? So, why are business models bad or considered taboo in each wave of innovation?
Yeah, so I would say in innovation proper, not so much. It's in fact, it's the question you hear repeatedly. Where's your business model? What's your business model? Particularly in the current environment, 2023, post another crash, at least in my lifetime that I've witnessed. That's the primary question you're going to get if you start anything new. But we can quickly go back over the many waves of innovation I've witnessed. I started out as far long ago as Netscape, which was the first real business model as documented in business and in academia. The first time we really had a hard time imagining how this new combination of ideas, technology, distributed internet, software, and hardware together could create all kinds of ways of making money. And it was really unclear. I was working at one of the investment banks that took Netscape public. And we saw that they were making some money in software and enterprise and in consumer, but that we could imagine all these possibilities. It got everybody very excited. But within a year, Microsoft launched the same exact function bundled into their current feature set. You'll see Microsoft doing that over and over again. And then we can just quickly go through the following waves of innovation and what business models folks thought would dominate each age. The first .com boom was all about e-commerce. Just take anything that you sell it online, multiply it by the number of people that buy it. Look, you get a market. And that's not what quite panned out. And so everybody's expectations kind of fell down all at once. The wave after that, it was build something amazing, build an audience, see what you can get. And that became advertising. The wave after that was, after that second kind of crash post-financial crisis, was marketplaces, Uber and Airbnb. And you remember the Uber for everything era. We thought we could turn everything into a marketplace. And even Uber hasn't yet, as of today, gotten to profitability, although Airbnb has. So, kind of a model that wasn't right for everybody. Then the software as a service model, you try it out for free, you eventually convert the company, Zoom, Slack. And what do we see there? The same move that Microsoft made back in the 90s. They made again, they built Teams and kind of like eclipsed the growth of Slack. So you see this like constant refrain, combinations of the same ideas over and over again. And we come to the AI era, we're seeing similar combinations. Who are the big movers? There's Microsoft again, combining with a kind of failed advertising product, the early moneymakers with ChatGPT, generative AI. They're just building this bundled into what they've already got. So we're actually not making, business model innovation is actually not about new ideas. It's about the combinations and recombinations of old ideas in novel ways. And I think we kind of have to break out of just the revenue stream cost structure concept in order to truly do something innovative.
So going back into that history, would you say that there was a business model for all those waves?
There was always a dominant business model that everyone was hoping would be the model, and I would say it depends on when you entered your career. If you were encouraged just to start something without worrying about the business model, that's because you entered at the time where everyone was hoping that the model would be advertising. They just wouldn't want to tell you because
Thank you.
And even if you read the history of Google, they those guys didn't want advertising to be the business model. They've written about how like kind of corrupting it would be. But post financial crash, they had to operate the business, venture capitalists getting impatient, very similar to today's environment. Advertising it became, and it's still, one of the most massive wealth creation stories of our time was Google's advertising business, for better or for worse.
That's so fascinating, because are you saying that that's a default, or are you saying that that was created by VCs and then, implicitly through their funding, just implicit?
So anytime, as soon as you take capital from angel investors, you're on a clock and you're under a gaze and you're under someone else's logic. There's some examples of companies that are able to dance outside of that logic, very few. But once you're in that, and especially as soon as you give control of your company over to your investors, which in our days tends to happen around Series B, you've lost control. You're now living into what those investors expect, and they can put a lot of pressure on you, even if you have supermajority shares. In the case of Google or Meta, to really go find revenue positive, profitability positive, inflection points of growth. And depending on the market folks are in, patience or impatience about how long that needs to take. That's the reality of any company that takes capital. That's not all companies, but any company that is set up as a C Corp and decides that they must take capital in order to start. So the real opportunities now, particularly with, it was the no code, low code movement. Now it's AI all over again. Each year you need less money to start something. The less money you need to start something, the more experimentation you can play and get time to start, the more creativity and options you have to really test new ideas.
Yeah, let's use that Chat GPT example. In our previous conversations, we talked about how even in this recession, there's a lot of jumping on that bandwagon without a business model. And then you just mentioned in this conversation that it's not about a new business model, but kind of recombining existing ones. So what advice do you have for all those AI Chat GPT companies? Like, how should they recombine existing business models?
Well, I mean, it's essentially, so I'm going to reframe. I think the question is like, how can you do something demonstrably different? Because right now, most of, like, if you look at the current Y Combinator class, those folks are just set up to be, technical features that reduce some kind of cost in someone else's model. And unless there's a real vision for how to move from that little wedge to something much bigger and broader and higher impact for humans, for the world, that's all they'll end up being. And that's not a truly disruptive, disrupt the business model kind of play, where maybe prior generations that was true. And so I think the desire, and if you're I've spoken to founders who are in the frenzy, getting the money quickly to go develop their little part of the stack, can be very exciting. It's like the only thing right now where there's FOMO, and it still feels like 2021 all over again. Still folks in that space, but to kind of take stock of that, do all the right things, make sure you've got your runway, but that you are actually experimenting with the full breadth of like what you can do, going from that feature set to kind of a new world order. And so if there's any big advice, it's like there is potential here to do something truly disruptive in the classic sense, like take on the giants, take on Google search, take on things we didn't even imagine we could take on social media. Like, these are areas that have been dead zones for investment for the past 10 years. But you can kind of take these on and play with them, be extremely focused in your short-term experimentation and extremely bold in your long-term vision.
I see. So in that runway, you're saying that there is a two-part phase. The first phase is reducing costs, being a productivity center. And then the second phase could be to go back in time or take on the existing FANG giants.
Do it now. Yeah, do it now. They're right now very vulnerable.
No, it's fascinating. Well, so to add on to that, and we're still at question number one, to add on to that, for tech people, for developers, and for design people, like design researchers who are not familiar with taking on a business model, is this for everyone, or how do they get started?
Yeah, I mean, so my practice is, I typically work with what founders are. Founders are mostly engineers. I wish I saw more designers. So I get to hang out at Parsons School of Design, where I have all designers. And I know that it's one of those practices, anybody can learn it. There's the basic tools like Business Model Canvas, which help you reason through some of the obvious parts of what makes a normative for-profit business model tick. But there's been so many wonderful variations of that tool for folks in the social impact spaces and the cooperative spaces. So I encourage you to go find the canvas that just helps you think the best. And, I would point you to, I've got a wonderful library on my website I can point you to if you want to look at patterns of business models, patterns of capital. That's the way I would think about it. Just, start playing with some of these things, combine and recombine, like those. I don't know if you had these as books as a kid, where you had like the chicken and the giraffe. Garanimals, you're sort of combining. Transformers is another concept where you combine and recombine ideas from past and present to see what's a novel way you can get uplift in a new idea.
Interesting. I'm actually creating a business model canvas software tool. I might get your feedback on that.
Yeah.
How about looking at the opportunity in terms of number of people searching for your keyword or your competitor, and then looking at the gaps, like how are the needs being unmet?
Yeah.
I think that's often not the Chat GPT way, because people are just like, oh, I just want to make the machine learning engine better, versus thinking about the dead spots and the opportunities. So
yeah, ChatGPT, like if you use the current version of it, even when it's updated to real time, it's going to have a hard time finding unarticulated needs. So as amazing as the tool is for envisioning all kinds of ways of making, I think designers will have the upper hand, because we know how to really do the right types of research to get into those unmet needs, to get into the unarticulated, hasn't yet been expressed dream space of folks. Particularly now that we're kind of seeing complex systems in ways we haven't before, complex adaptive systems. We're addressing these wicked challenges. And it's not just this like low-hanging fruit of some software as a service tool or some consumer app that's going to get us to where we need to go as a species. We're going to need to do much deeper things. So I actually believe in the same way at the business model, business valuation class at business school, they sort of say the poets have a better job than the quants of understanding company valuation, because it's mostly story at the beginning. Designers are going to have I'm going to say something dramatic. Designers will have the upper hand in the next wave of company formation, if they choose to found companies, because they can tell the difference between, AI generated automation and true human need, human insight, and have the kind of embodied sense to know when to move.
That's divisive. Yeah, I love it. Can you restate that?
Yeah. I mean, or maybe it's a call, like for all designers out there, to know that despite what you're seeing on, pick your social media of choice about how, if you don't adopt AI, you will be disrupted, and design will be the first job to go away unless you use these tools. Sure, for a PowerPoint template that didn't really need design to begin with, yes, if that was your job, I'm sorry, that PowerPoint design job is going to go away. But if I know designers, I know they didn't like that job anyway. And that it's really about this extremely human, deep understanding of humanity, listening to unmet needs, understanding complexity, realizing that we can't just solve for a single consumer need or a single business need and say that, we're done. We've solved some major human problem. We've got these rich, complex issues. We're deeply involved in them. And, the designer skill set, practice, and habit, the 10,000 hours of listening to humans, designing with humans, participating, co-designing, these are the skills we need to have that felt sense of like we're on the right path. It's something that so far AI isn't close to doing.
I love it. I love having you have that stake in the ground, that strong point of view. And so the last question before we move on to the next question, last question for this first question about why business models are bad or taboo is, what kind of advice do you have for technical founders who are not really used to talking to users, or designers who are really not used to business models? Like, how do they feel confident getting started?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the design practice is. So for engineers first, it's, you can learn this concept of value proposition design, really start there. There's great books out there. It's very simple. Most engineers are trained to think about jobs to be done, unmet needs. And if for whatever reason you're not super confident doing that work, although I encourage you to do it directly, because you get that like much different feedback when you're in the room with a human, looking at their bodily expressions and frowns and squints when you speak. To partner with someone who's done it for the 10,000 hours. Share notes after each meeting with a potential customer. Do that work. A good 10 interviews on one topic gets you some pretty rich insight. You don't have to do thousands, per value proposition, per idea. Each time you have a new feature idea you think is valuable, have those kinds of direct one-on-ones with customers. That becomes the basis of any business model. It starts with a value proposition. It's like value proposition, you have it or you don't. There's no reason you should figure out anything else or do any math or figure out partners until you have that core idea fully validated and tested. This is my segment. This is my value proposition. That's something I think engineers deeply understand because they're used to building features, sets, and user stories. I think designers are trained to do that work if they went to school or they're in practice and learned on their own in the field. That's at the beginning of something, at the founder stage, that is what the business model is. It's mostly value proposition and how to charge revenue for it when the revenue comes. Everything else follows the success or failure of that hypothesis.
Awesome, because you teach so many students at Parsons. I think as a teacher, that advice is really valuable. Just start at that core before you get ahead and build anything.
And something I've learned from my students, I used to do it later on in their learning, is to do these unit economics exercises. Let's figure out the turn of the wheel of that first value proposition, on a napkin or in a Google sheet. Price, cost, what's the cost of the thing, whether it's an app or a more complex idea or a retail store or a drop ship something. And my students have told me that they wish they'd have learned that right away, that it helps them imagine the possibility space better and redirect them to something more valuable, particularly for folks in the social impact space who tend to delay thinking about the price and the cost until a little too late. So we now do that upfront right away. As soon as we have a concept, we do napkin sketch unit economics and then decide, okay, do we stay with this value proposition or do we move to another?
Actually, I lied. So one more question about this part. What's an example of that? I don't know if you can share from your practice or your student business cases, but is there an example that you can give us of the back of the napkin?
I get really common themes, especially at school, of folks who want to start. Very common one is the artisan craft marketplace. Someone comes from a country with a rich crafting tradition, and they want to, preserve the historical craft practices of a dying trade, a generation of folks that are dying off in the younger generation. This is, almost every year we get like 10 or 11 folks that want to start this exact same business. And what's the unit of that? Well, that could be so many things. It could be that you have a marketplace. It could be that you are representing some kind of, are you taking a cut of that? Is it a full nonprofit and you're just designing an educational learning model? Are you sourcing artisans and crafts folks to the fashion trade? And how do you do that in an ethical manner? So like all of these questions need to be sorted out right away before you even get down to your decision about what is that value proposition. It's not always obvious. And not every person's going to start their own unique marketplace. So it's experimenting with all of these ideas and zeroing in on it. And, I've got a student right now who's already comes to the school with some strong relationships with the nonprofit and is now looking to see how that can be extended as like a learning experience with folks sponsoring the learning pathway. But I've seen many other cases of that same business model experimented with over and over again. And as soon as we get down to those units, that's when kind of everything becomes clear about what feels right at the start.
And that can be profitable, that type of business?
So in the case of let's say in the case of a nonprofit, it can cover the cost. I mean, you can design a nonprofit program revenues to cover the costs. So it's a different thing than designing it for a for-profit, which would be about, a true marketplace model, Uber for crafts, which like Uber might be a long way to profitability.
That's right. Okay. Well, we're going to move on to question 2. If anyone in the podcast has any questions, you can chat them. So question 2, if you were to start a business, what type of business model would it have?
Yeah. Let's see. So it's like of the times we're in. So I'm really curious about new organizational design structures, really to experiment with something. I'd probably choose a data cooperative with a multiple array of revenue types. So what this would mean is we would join together in a cooperative model where we co-own our data together. We could do that in a formal structure like a cooperative. Lots of people have experimented this with distributed autonomous organizations on blockchain. There's incredibly both wonderful and speculative and weird energy around that space, but it can be done in a variety of organizational types. I think the core principle I'd want to play with is in this era of lack of trust, concerns about privacy, varying regulatory stances of EU versus US versus the rest of the world, that folks band together and say, this is our data around this topic, maybe particularly in healthcare, maybe around a specific rare disease even, and say that this is our data cooperative, we're joining together and we're banding together, and we're going to be a group of people that puts ourselves out there for research purposes and democratically decides and determines how any payment towards us is distributed to ourselves or to the community or to the cause. I mean, I think that would be that would hit all my buttons right now of like most creative opportunity to really play in a business model landscape and get a different outcome than what we've seen, particularly in healthcare and privacy and data. And there's companies out there already doing it, so it's not a novel idea.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, tell us more about those companies. Is it a model where if a patient shares their data, they would have equity as much as the company or the platform?
I haven't seen one with equity as the kicker. I've seen distributed autonomous organizations that give a token. I've seen cooperative structures where patients co-own what is essentially consulting service revenue for insights. I've seen emerging ideas, mostly coming out of Europe, where a cooperative we constructed kind of like a patient data repository or biobank. These are old school business models, but doing that in a way that's, again, cooperatively owned. Cooperatively owned, meaning it's a different structure. There's no equity in a co-op. You just co-own together. Everybody gets an equal share. It's a hard thing for Americans to grasp sometimes. But I belong to a nursery school co-op here in Manhattan, and the parents co-own the nursery school, and we passed it over to the next generation of parents when our kid graduated out of nursery school. So it happens here. It's actually a growing organizational form here in the city. So it's an interesting and rich place to play. Like, it's a how might we question. What would the world look like if we co-owned these activities together?
I see. So instead of a couple of people sharing equity, then everyone who shares their data or is involved in the platform.
Yeah, and there's always equity for, there's always an extra benefit for those that start or form in how you design these things, or sometimes not. It's up to the creators of the idea. But just a different, again, for things that are like really intractable, difficult problems where we haven't been able to get the folks we need to participate in the way we need them to. If you're asking me where I'd like to most play, that's a place I'd like to play.
Well, healthcare, with HIPAA and all the privacy laws, is a really difficult, intractable problem, like you mentioned. So, what are the companies that are making an impact, or what makes you interested in healthcare?
I think after, let's see, where are we now? About 10, 15 years into the health tech revolution, we're now sort of speaking as honestly about what's working, what's not. This is going to sound morbid, but the bankruptcies are starting to happen. So we're now able to see, at least in health tech, like what had legs and what didn't. Where was the incumbent system ready to play with the new ideas, and where were the incumbent systems not moving fast enough? And we're getting really interesting pressure from the concentration of power amongst incumbents. So the market's gotten like more powerful to the incumbents in healthcare over the last 10 years, despite all the new entrants. So ultimately, it sounds terrifying. It shouldn't excite any new entrant, but it's such an interesting time because of where we are with the lowering cost of the genome, the explosion of really interesting ways you can bring a medical device to market, the more nimbleness of the FDA and German regulatory systems to move swiftly with digital therapeutics and things like that. So it's this, again, if you like to combine and recombine, and you like to play in spaces that are complex and adaptive, it's got all this like wonderful, rich stuff to play in. It's where I spend a lot, not all of my time, but a lot of my time.
Okay. Well, I hope you'll share some of these resources and, canvases and histories so that the audience can not reinvent the wheel, but also recombine some of the great ideas that already exist. And then the third and last question is, how do businesses get funded without a business model today?
Yeah, let's see. So right now, it's probably the hardest time to just show up with 3 amazing founders from some high pedigree institution and just demand some cash to go. It's not impossible. It's still happening. But now is probably not the best time to start that way. So the best thing you can do is a business model doesn't mean you have revenue yet. A business model is your mental model for how you're going to make money. It's not meant to be correct. It's not meant to have all the answers. It's supposed to be indicative of where you see the business growing. So I think you can start a business without revenue, but it would really help right now to actually have the model for how you might make money. What I've seen in the last 3 months, for the first time in a long time, and I'm saying like 6 or 7 years, early stage, seed stage companies, if I'm working with a company, I'll always generate the model in Google Sheets or Excel. And just, no one's asked for it. It just stays there. It's like a document of how we're thinking, and feed it to the lead finance person, or, who's ever the interim CFO, to operate as they generate investment briefs and make sure the founders really understand it. And we kind of leave it at that level. But for the last 4 months, in seed round investments, I've seen a lot of investors demand to see that and play with and question all of the variables in those models, and ask for 5-year projections. So that this is, again, for companies that don't yet have revenue, but they have a pretty good line of sight into when that revenue would show up, and a pretty good theory for how it will come. And what is happening in those meetings is not so much a demand of where's your revenue and how can you get it faster, although that's definitely usually a key question. It's more of a from the investor's perspective, can I take the risk? And by the way, I can get 5, 6, 7% from government investment right now. So you got to hit a pretty high threshold of future growth, in order to merit highly risky early stage investment. So you better have a business model to back up your plan, meaning whatever you're starting at the beginning has some, far-reaching idea for how there might be that kind of inflection point of growth. So it's reasoning backwards from that kind of big idea. And I find, again, back in a classroom setting, I have a classroom filled with folks that want to do beautiful local manufacturing, artisan craft, mutual aid type ideas, and folks also that want to, hit a home run with some big health tech idea, like this all in one classroom. So I love seeing all those things come together. But if if you want grant funding or equity funding, this exercise of dreaming numerically really helps give folks, if not confidence, at least their own ability to assess the opportunity and risk, so they know how to make the decision of whether or not you get the check.
Yeah, I always tell founders, if you don't think about the business model, it'll think about you and then force you in a really tight place, especially when you're running out of runway. So it's just
at this point, you'll just become what happens to a lot of SaaS, software as a service companies without strongly tested business models is they just become consulting services companies that just randomly, getting money, and it's not productized and scalable. So it's really worth doing, especially in the kind of market that we're in that's very churn oriented, choppy, 12, 18, 24-month sales cycles, to be flexible and adaptable, but to still be very focused on what am I building here that I could repeat when the growth arrives.
And then, I've seen that where developers have this vision of creating something that's really scalable, like one to many. And then they're consultants. They build one version for a big client and then they retool it for another client. They don't even really get to white label it. It's just a one-off build. So that's motivating for developers. And then for designers, the people who have the social responsibility interest, how do you get them excited about the unit economic?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I work with designers across the globe. I think it might be a US focused thing that we think that designers are the one that hold the social responsibility. I know our design schools are part of that. They all have a very strong, ethics framework, solidarity, economics. I don't apologize for that. I think it's amazing. But if you work with designers across industries, you realize it's this is not just we're not just precious little creatures who, have the highest ethical stances. And if anything, our role in this in relationship to business is that you can't really change the world until you change the economic structures of the world. And so unless you are learning how to negotiate we'll use a design term, affordances, the spaces in which we operate, and really deeply understand at the unit level and the bigger investment level, like how, if you're doing human-centered design and you're not questioning these structures, these flows, these economic circumstances, these expectations for capital return, if you're not part of that and you're just living in that system, you're not changing anything. You're just dancing on a Titanic. And so this is an appeal to the folks that believe that they're socially motivated, pro-social, maybe even only, have their practices have moved to government because they're afraid of industry. I encourage you, stop that, come back. It's the connection between industry and government where some of the most interesting work is happening, where some of the most innovative work is happening. Spend the time to learn some of these ways of seeing the world, the magnetic forces that keep things kind of locked into the same structures and systems. And only then can we really start to question what and how we redesign. And our tools of redesign then become organizational and financial, versus what the financial world sees as the realm of design, which is frankly superficial and surface level. And so this is an upside down view of the world, but it's when you do that, you sort of start to see why, after so many years of sustainable design, ESG, SDG, all these incredible acronyms, adopting circular economy, like just whatever, regenerative now, why we keep seeing the same thing over and over again. And the numerator and the numerator changes, we change what we make, but the denominator doesn't. We're still making the same stuff. like in order to really affect these ratios, in order to really affect consumption, and this is the tool that designers have, we're the only ones that can design different consumption. We have the capacity to design new consumption models. But to really make that change, we have to be aware of what's underneath.
I'm going to use that and I'm going to credit you because there's so many brilliant people that I consult, and it's not that they don't know how to change the unit economics. They just don't want to. Like,
it's icky. It feels, there's something in our Western way of learning where you sort of peel away from math and you peel away from finance if you're doing something aesthetic and visual and human-centered. And therefore, you're in a little box.
Absolutely. Well,
Very pretty box, but it's, you're constrained, and sometimes you can't see the mechanisms around you that are keeping all the logic set as it is.
Yeah, the smartest people have this assumption that they can't touch the unit economic and that it'll mar or, take away from the vision. But
yes,
yeah,
it doesn't feel as fun. It doesn't feel as creative. But I encourage you, use the tools you already use to break it down. There's always I always play with things visually first. In the old days, it was stickies and walls and drawing. And now it's, all of the same whiteboarding tools you're all using. And we move it, we sort of have a rule in my practice. We don't move it into Sheets or Excel until we validated some things. We keep it squishy and conceptual when we don't know. And then when we start getting that validity happening, that validation phase, okay, now we're ready to play with these things in variables and numbers and math, and start talking with the CFO, the controller, and and those folks can be incredibly creative, but they create in numerical form, and they don't feel confident making decisions until they can play with those numerical variables. So not necessarily to see those folks as buzzkills or risk averse or not wanting to take innovative. They do. But they can't always react to like a visual presentation of an idea and take on the assumption of all that risk and opportunity without that mental model of the kind of the numerical form of that same concept.
Thank you, because that's empathy for your team, right? So the person who does monetization is not the boring person. It's like the person who saves
not
you
always.
at that stage. Not always. And they just see it in a different way. They need to see it in a different format, a different table, something that they can understand.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we're closing to the end. Do you have any questions for the community? You're a thought leader, so you probably don't have any questions, but are you thinking about any topics? You mentioned healthcare. Are you thinking about any business or design topics that you would like other people to contribute to, or
it's the big ones. It's please move into healthcare, climate, particularly around consumption, which is what designers are good at, like the new ways of consumption, so that we're not all just dependent on extracting all of the Earth's cobalt in the next 10 years. Which means that we have to fix the numerator versus the denominator. Like everybody in engineering is just going to focus on extracting all the materials. We need that balance of design to say, do we have to extract all of that cobalt? If there are other ways we can think of experiencing and interacting that don't require so much materials. I believe one of the most interesting places is actually art, and the way we're reshaping and recombining and organizing ourselves around creative expression. So these are amazing places to play right now. Lots of energy, lots of excitement. There isn't a recession in at least a couple of those fields. So come and play if you lost your job at a tech giant.
Awesome. Well, I think I'm going to, if you accept or don't accept, it's okay, but I'd like to give you the nickname Jen, the denominator.
That's funny. I'll take it. Okay.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for taking the time today to share your thoughts and answers. And I hope that students and clients alike will get in touch with you. I am also going to use a voice AI transcription for our conversation today. So I'll be sending you a version that you can approve what the machine thinks we said. Okay. And then I'll probably post that as part of this podcast. And everyone, thanks for tuning in to Founder Design Thinking number 8. The next one will be with a art world founder. And then perhaps the one after that will be with this voice AI founder. So
great.
Everyone, keep the questions coming. And thanks again, Jen, for your time today.
Thanks, Jenny.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Bye.